The sound of a sharp slap echoed through the wide sitting room just as Chief Demiller pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into his mansion. His eyes widened in horror as he froze at the sight before him, his wife, Clara, raising her hand and punching his old, crippled mother across the face. The old woman fell back against the arm of the chair, too weak to defend herself, her walking stick clattering to the tiled floor. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The billionaire stood still, his breath caught in his throat, his body trembling with shock. He had just returned from a business trip in Dubai, excited to surprise his family, but instead, he had walked into a nightmare. Mama Funk's face twisted with pain, her frail body shaking, but her eyes burned with the fire of someone who had endured too much already. She struggled to sit upright, her voice low but steady. "Did I not warn you, Demiller?" she whispered through cracked lips. "Did I not tell you this woman will bring shame into this house?" Her words cut deep, slicing through the billionaire's chest like a blade. He remembered those warnings clearly, the late-night talks when Mema had begged him not to marry Clara, telling him she had seen darkness in her eyes. But he had laughed then, dismissing her words as the fears of an old woman. Now, standing in that room, he felt the bitter sting of regret flooding his heart. Clara, realizing she had been caught, quickly turned around. Her face wore no sign of guilt, only arrogance. "You don't understand," she snapped, her voice sharp. "Your mother provokes me. She treats me like I am nothing, always insulting me in this house. I only defended myself." But the billionaire's eyes never left the bruise forming on his mother's cheek. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the battle between rage and disbelief boiling inside him. He had given Clara everything: wealth, status, a name that opened doors, and yet here she was, lifting her hands against the very woman who had given him life. The room grew heavy with silence, broken only by Mama Funk's soft sobs. She lowered her gaze, refusing to meet her son's eyes. Deep down, she had always known this day would come, but she never thought he would see it with his own eyes. Clara stood tall, arms crossed, as if daring him to speak, daring him to choose. The air was tense, almost choking, as if the mansion itself was holding its breath, waiting for the explosion that was sure to follow. Demiller felt his chest tightening, his heartbeat pounding against his ribs. The life he thought he had built was beginning to crumble right before his eyes. He took one step forward, his voice low but shaking. "Clara, tell me you did not just raise your hand against my mother." His question hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud, but Clara only smirked, her silence screaming louder than any words. The billionaire clenched his fists, torn between love and fury, between the vow he made at the altar and the blood that ran through his veins. For a moment, he looked at his mother, her tears rolling freely, and then back at his wife, whose pride stood tall like a wall between them. The room trembled with the weight of his next move, until suddenly, Clara opened her mouth and said something that made the billionaire's heart stop cold. The story does not begin with that slap, nor with the bitter tears in Mama Funk's eyes. No, it begins months before that cursed day, when Chief Demiller's life looked perfect to the world, and Clara's arrogance was still caged in her own world. To understand the weight of that punch, we must go back to the beginning, to a time when two lives moved on separate paths, not yet crossing, but already heading toward the same storm. Chief Demiller Adeyemi was a man whose name carried power in Nigeria. At only 42, he was already one of the richest men in Lagos. His companies stretched from oil and gas to real estate, banking, and even a private airline. Newspapers praised him as a genius, the man who could turn anything he touched into gold. He lived in a glass mansion on the island, drove cars that sparkled like moving mirrors, and attended parties where the high and mighty bowed to him. But behind all the shine and the noise, he remained a quiet man, shaped by his mother's prayers and the memories of a childhood filled with struggle. His mother, Mama Funk, was the backbone of his story. Crippled from an accident in her youth, she had raised him alone after losing her husband to illness. She had hawked bread and beans on the streets of Ibadan to pay his school fees, her legs failing her but her spirit unbroken. Every success Demiller enjoyed, he credited to her sacrifices. He often told friends that his wealth was not his own, but a crown placed on his head by his mother's suffering. Despite her condition, Mama Funk had never allowed self-pity to rule her life. She was strong, sharp-tongued, and unafraid to tell her son the truth, even when others worshipped him like a god. But being a billionaire came with its own shadow. Every day, women chased after him, not for who he was, but for the wealth he carried. They smiled sweetly at parties, sent him flattering messages, and some even pretended to bump into him by chance at airports or hotels. Demille had grown used to this game. He avoided scandals and maintained his dignity, but even the strongest walls can have cracks. Unknown to him, somewhere in another corner of Lagos, a woman whose heart carried more pride than love was living her own story. Her name was Clara. Clara grew up far from the disciplined world that shaped Demille. Born into a family that never struggled for food, she had always known comfort. Her father was a retired army officer, and her mother a businesswoman who spoiled her only daughter beyond reason. From childhood, Clara had developed a sharp tongue and a fiery temper. She believed the world owed her respect, even when she had done nothing to earn it. In school, she was known for her beauty, but also for her arrogance. Teachers whispered that she was clever, but her pride closed the doors her intelligence could have opened. She wanted everything fast, everything easy, and above all, she wanted to be admired. By her 20s, Clara had become the kind of woman who left people talking long after she passed. Tall, light-skinned, and always dressed in the latest fashion, she turned heads wherever she went. But the beauty was often wasted on her bitterness. She spoke harshly to waiters in restaurants, rolled her eyes at her own cousins, and treated her friends as though they were beneath her. Men flocked around her, dazzled by her looks, but many left quickly, unable to endure the fire of her rudeness. Still, she carried herself with pride, convinced that one day a man powerful enough would come along and give her the life she believed she deserved. Meanwhile, Demille's fame only grew. He was constantly in the news, not for scandals, but for achievements. When he opened a new hospital wing in Abuja, the press praised his generosity. When he donated millions to scholarships, students sang his name. He was the kind of man many fathers prayed their daughters would marry. Yet behind closed doors, he remained a simple son who spent evenings sitting by his mother's side, massaging her weak legs, listening to her stories of the past. To him, she was not just his mother, she was his advisor, his shield, the only one who dared speak to him without fear of his status. Clara, on the other hand, spent her nights in clubs, laughing loudly over glasses of expensive wine paid for by men eager to impress her. She never worked a serious job for long. Whenever a boss corrected her, she would flare up, quit, and brag to her friends that no one could control her. In her mind, she was destined for greatness, but she lacked the patience to build it. Many people avoided her because of her sharp tongue, but Clara was blind to her own flaws. She looked at the mirror every day and told herself, "I deserve more." Demille's story and Clara's story moved like two rivers, each flowing strongly but apart. One river was full of discipline, sacrifice, and quiet power. The other was wild, restless, and stained with arrogance. Yet destiny was already drawing them closer, even though neither of them could see it. And while Mema Funk prayed for a humble woman who would honor her son, Clara's heart grew even harder, convinced that the world was her stage and every man was her audience. They had not met yet, but the storm was already building. Demille was looking for a wife who could fit into his world, someone who could respect his mother and walk by his side with dignity. Clara was looking for a man who could give her everything without question. Two lives, two hearts, moving toward each other, toward that mansion, toward that slap, toward the day everything would change. Life has a strange way of weaving stories together. While Demille continued his life as one of Nigeria's most admired billionaires, Clara's restless spirit was leading her straight into his world, though neither of them yet knew what destiny was planning. The glass doors of Adeyemi Holdings opened wide one bright Monday morning, and Clara stepped into the building that would eventually change her life. She had applied for a job there weeks earlier, not because she was desperate for work, but because she was drawn by the glamour of the company's name. To her, it was less about building a career and more about being associated with something prestigious. Adeyemi Holdings was not just any company, it was a kingdom in its own right. With its head office standing tall in Victoria Island, the building gleamed with marble floors, golden elevators, and wide halls that smelled of wealth and power. Employees moved quickly in suits and heels, their ID cards bouncing against their chests as they carried files and laptops. It was a place where mistakes were not tolerated, where excellence was demanded at every level. For most people, working there was a dream they would never forget. For Clara, however, it was just another stage for her pride. Clara had been hired as a junior staff in the company's public relations department. Her role was simple: assist with communication strategies, handle some documents, and occasionally attend events on behalf of the firm. But to Clara, every small task felt like an insult. She walked into the office on her first day with her head high, wearing a red designer gown that drew stares from everyone in the room. Instead of blending in quietly, she announced herself with her presence, speaking loudly, correcting others sharply, and rolling her eyes at colleagues she thought were beneath her. Within a week, gossip about her had already spread through the office corridors. De Miller, though far above the daily operations of that department, often visited the upper floors of the building where Clara's unit was located. As the CEO, he rarely interacted with junior staff directly, but he had sharp eyes. He noticed details others missed. The first time he saw Clara, she was walking down the hall, her heels clicking confidently on the tiled floor. She was carrying a file carelessly under her arm, talking too loudly to a colleague. De Miller paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing, not because he was impressed, but because something about her presence caught his attention. She reminded him of fire, dangerous, uncontrolled, but impossible to ignore. At first, his admiration was not about love. It was about curiosity. De Miller had met countless women in his life, but most of them either bowed too quickly before his wealth or tried too hard to impress him. Clara, on the other hand, carried herself as though she owed no one anything. He noticed the way she walked into meetings late, the way she interrupted people without fear, and the way her beauty drew whispers among the men in the office. She had flaws that would normally repel him, but instead, he found himself watching her from afar, studying her as though she were a puzzle he could not yet solve. Clara noticed him too, though not immediately. In her mind, the CEO of Adeyemi Holdings was just another rich man who lived in a world far above hers. She had seen his face in newspapers, on television, and on office posters that praised his leadership. But the first time she saw him in person, stepping out of the elevator with 2 bodyguards behind him, she felt a strange chill run through her. De Miller had a presence that filled the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with quiet authority. His suit was perfectly tailored, his shoes polished like mirrors, and yet his eyes were calm, almost gentle. Clara, for once, found herself speechless, though she quickly masked it with her usual arrogance. Mema Funk remained at home during those days, her life revolving around prayers and quiet evenings with her son. She had no idea that destiny was already at work in his company, slowly tying him to the very woman she feared most. Whenever De Miller returned home, she reminded him to be careful about women, to choose a wife not for beauty but for character. A beautiful face can hide a wicked heart, she often said, her voice soft but firm. De Miller would smile, kiss her forehead, and assure her that he had everything under control. But deep down, he found himself thinking more and more about the new staff with the sharp tongue and the striking face. The staff at Adeyemi Holdings began to notice too. Whispers filled the office whenever De Miller walked past Clara, his eyes lingering for a second longer than usual. "Have you seen the way Olga looks at her?" some of the ladies whispered by the water dispenser. "Clara better be careful, that man is not one to play with." Others shook their heads, warning her to keep her arrogance in check. But Clara, instead of being humbled by the attention, let it feed her pride. She believed she had finally found the stage she deserved, and she was determined to shine, no matter who stood in her way. One Friday evening, during a company dinner held at the Eco Hotel, Clara had her first real interaction with De Miller. She was seated at a table with other junior staff when the CEO himself entered the hall. All eyes turned to him as he greeted the executives and made his way to the podium. Clara, dressed in a glittering silver gown, leaned back in her chair, pretending not to care. But her heart raced when, midway through his speech, De Miller's eyes locked with hers for a brief moment. It was not a long look, but it was enough to send a strange shiver down her spine. For the first time in her life, she felt as though someone had truly seen her. From that day, De Miller found himself watching her more closely. He noticed the contradictions in her, the beauty that shone on the outside, the pride that oozed from her words, and the fragile loneliness that sometimes appeared in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. He admired her strength, even if it was often misused. He admired her boldness, even if it came across as arrogance. But most of all, he admired the way she seemed untouched by the weight of his wealth, the way she stood tall in a world where most people bowed. It was dangerous admiration, but it grew quietly inside him. Clara, on her part, began to sense his attention. At first, she dismissed it, telling herself he was just another man who would eventually fall at her feet. But something about de Miller was different. He was not desperate for her attention, nor did he shower her with empty words. Instead, he watched quietly, like a man who saw beyond her beauty. This unsettled Clara in ways she could not explain. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps she had met a man who could match her pride with calm strength. And so, day by day, in that glittering building on Victoria Island, their lives began to circle closer and closer. He, the billionaire with a heart shaped by his mother's suffering. She, the proud young woman who believed the world belonged to her. They had not yet touched hands, had not yet exchanged more than polite greetings, but the air between them already carried a spark. A spark that would soon grow into a fire neither of them could control. For weeks, the unspoken dance continued between de Miller and Clara. He would see her in the office corridors, her heels clicking like drumbeats on marble floors, her perfume lingering faintly in the air. She carried files as though she owned the building, and when she spoke, her voice carried a sharp edge that made weaker staff shrink. Yet, beneath all that pride, de Miller kept seeing something else, something fragile that Clara herself didn't even seem aware of. Every now and then, when she thought no one was looking, he caught glimpses of her eyes softening, her lips curving into a thoughtful silence. It was these moments, rare but striking, that kept pulling him in deeper. Clara noticed him too, though she never admitted it. Each time the tall figure of the billionaire walked past her office floor, she felt her body stiffen. She would pretend to be busy with papers or typing on her laptop, but her heart always betrayed her. She told herself it was nothing, that men like him always looked at women like her, but she could not deny that his quiet attention unsettled her. Unlike other men, he never rushed, never flirted, never boasted. He simply watched, and in his silence, he seemed to say more than words could. In the office, whispers began to grow louder. Staff noticed the way the CEO's eyes lingered on Clara, the way his steps slowed whenever she was around. "Something is happening," they murmured by the elevators. Some warned Clara to be careful, others were jealous, rolling their eyes whenever she walked by. Clara, in her pride, let the gossip fuel her confidence. She tossed her hair, wore brighter dresses, and walked with even more fire in her steps. Deep down, she was waiting for the day he would finally speak. That day came on a quiet Tuesday evening. Clara had stayed back late at the office, grumbling over some reports she was supposed to submit. Most of the staff had already gone home, the building growing silent except for the hum of air conditioners. She was bent over her desk when a shadow fell across her papers. Looking up, she saw him, Chief de Miller Adeyemi himself, standing tall, his suit jacket slung casually over one arm, his eyes calm but direct. Clara's heart skipped, though she quickly masked it with her usual arrogance. "Sir," she said, pretending to be surprised. De Miller gave a small smile, the kind that softened his strong features. "You work late," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of calm authority. Clara shrugged. "Someone has to finish these files," she replied, tapping her pen against the desk as if she didn't care. But in truth, her palms had begun to sweat. She wasn't used to being nervous, and she didn't like it. Yet the way he stood there, watching her with that steady gaze, made her feel stripped of all her defenses. After a moment, de Miller spoke again. "Clara," he said, his voice slow, deliberate. "Would you join me for dinner sometime this week?" The question hung in the air like a heavy jewel. Clara's pen slipped from her hand and rolled across the desk, though she quickly picked it up to hide her sudden tremor. She raised her chin, trying to act unfazed. "Dinner?" she asked, as though the invitation meant little. But inside, her mind raced. This was it, the moment every woman in the company had probably dreamed of. De Miller didn't press. He simply nodded once, his expression calm, as though he already knew her answer. "Yes," he said softly. "Dinner. Nothing formal, Nothing business-related. Just dinner. Then he waited, giving her space to decide. Clara allowed the silence to stretch, pretending to weigh her options. But in truth, she had already decided. No woman in her right mind would refuse a billionaire's invitation, least of all her. Finally, she gave a small nod, her lips curving into a faint smile. "All right. Dinner," she said, her voice smooth but betraying a spark of excitement. The next few days were filled with whispers and speculation. Clara tried to keep the news quiet, but somehow it spread across the office like wildfire. "She's going out with Ogre," one junior staff exclaimed by the copier. "Can you imagine? Clara and the CEO." Some people congratulated her with fake smiles, others hissed behind her back, saying she was lucky and nothing more. Clara soaked it all in, enjoying the attention. To her, this was proof that she was destined for something greater. Meanwhile, Demille found himself strangely nervous. For all his power and experience, he had never been this unsettled about a woman. He kept telling himself it was just dinner, just a chance to know her beyond the gossip and the arrogance. But deep inside, he felt the stirrings of something he could not easily name. He had everything a man could want: wealth, fame, respect, but this dinner felt like stepping into unknown territory, like opening a door that might never close again. The chosen evening arrived, and Demille sent one of his drivers to pick Clara up. She stepped out of her apartment building dressed in a fitted emerald gown, her hair styled neatly, her lips painted a bold red. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as the sleek black SUV waited by the roadside, its tinted windows reflecting the streetlights. Clara walked with pride, enjoying the stares, feeling like a queen about to claim her throne. The dinner took place at a private restaurant in Ikoyi, a place known only to the elite. The room was softly lit with golden chandeliers, the tables decorated with fresh roses. When Clara entered, guided by the waiter, she found Demille already seated, his suit crisp, his face calm but welcoming. He stood to greet her, pulling out her chair with quiet respect. Clara raised her brows slightly. She was used to men falling over themselves to impress her, but his calmness unsettled her more than desperation ever could. The meal began with small talk, but soon the conversation grew deeper. Demille asked about her life, her family, her dreams. Clara, unused to being genuinely listened to, found herself talking more than she expected. She bragged here and there, of course, painting herself larger than life, but Demille didn't seem put off. Instead, he studied her carefully, nodding, smiling faintly, and occasionally asking questions that forced her to think. By the time dessert was served, Clara realized she had spoken more openly than she had with any man before. For Demille, the evening was revealing. He saw her flaws clearly: the pride, the sharpness, the way she dismissed small people as though they didn't matter. But he also saw her strength, her confidence, and the fire in her eyes. She was not like other women who bent under his wealth. She stood tall, even too tall at times, but it fascinated him. He knew his mother would disapprove, yet something in him whispered that Clara was different, and different was what he craved. When the dinner ended, he walked her out to the waiting SUV. For a moment, they stood under the night sky, the city lights flickering around them. Clara tilted her chin, her pride still intact, but her heart racing faster than she admitted. Demille gave her a gentle smile, his eyes warm. "Thank you for tonight," he said simply. Clara smirked slightly, masking her own gratitude. "Well," she replied, "I don't usually say yes to dinners. But maybe this one wasn't so bad." With that, she slipped into the car, leaving Demille standing there, his thoughts spinning. As the SUV drove her away, Clara leaned back against the leather seat, her lips curling into a smile. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what life could be like if she played her cards right. For Demille, watching the car disappear into the night, he felt a dangerous tug in his heart, a pull that told him this was only the beginning of something far bigger than he could control. The days that followed their first dinner seemed to move with a different rhythm. Demille still maintained his calm dignity in the office, never giving anyone the chance to accuse him of favoritism, but his eyes often sought Clara's without his permission. He found himself thinking about her at odd times, during board meetings, in his private jet, even when he sat beside his mother at dinner. It was a dangerous distraction for a man like him, but he could not resist. Clara had left an imprint on his thoughts, and no matter how he tried to dismiss it, she remained there like a shadow he could not shake. Clara, on the other hand, soaked in the attention. Though she pretended to be unaffected, she replayed moments from their dinner in her mind late at night. She would lie on her bed, scrolling through her phone, but then suddenly smile at the memory of how he looked at her across the candlelit table. She told herself it was nothing, that she was simply enjoying the thrill of catching the eye of one of Nigeria's most powerful men. Yet, her heart betrayed her, she had never felt so seen before. In the office, the gossip only grew louder. Some colleagues whispered that Clara was using her beauty to climb the ladder. Others said she would soon become the next Madame Adiemi. Clara pretended not to hear, but she noticed the envious stares whenever she walked past. Her pride swelled with each whisper, and though she masked it with casual indifference, inside she felt triumphant. For once, she believed her destiny was unfolding exactly as she had always imagined. Meanwhile, Mama Funk remained blissfully unaware of the dinners and the growing closeness. At home, she still spoke to her son with the same firmness as always, warning him about women who only cared for money. "Demilla," she would say as he massaged her weak legs, "many women smile sweetly, but behind their smile is poison. Be careful." Demilla would nod, listening quietly, but in his mind, Clara's face would always appear. He knew his mother's words came from love, but he also felt something pulling him toward Clara, something he couldn't explain. Their second meeting happened sooner than Clara expected. One evening, as she was leaving the office, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was short and simple: "Dinner again? Same place. 8 p.m. D.A." Clara smiled to herself, her heart racing, though she quickly frowned as if to scold herself. She told herself she was not desperate, but she still spent hours choosing the right dress, the right heels, the perfect perfume. By the time the driver arrived to pick her up, she looked like a woman who had planned for this moment her whole life. The restaurant in Ikoyi welcomed them again, the staff treating Demilla with quiet respect. This time, Clara was more relaxed, her pride softened by curiosity. They spoke about her childhood, about her family, and for the first time, Clara admitted how she often felt misunderstood. She spoke of people who thought she was arrogant, when in truth, she believed she was simply strong. Demilla listened carefully, his eyes never leaving her face. It was not her words alone that drew him in, but the way her voice trembled slightly when she spoke about loneliness. As the evening deepened, Demilla finally broke the silence that had been hanging between them since their first meeting. He leaned slightly closer, his voice calm but steady. "Clara," he said, his eyes locking into hers, "I like you." The words were simple, almost too simple for a man of his stature, but they carried the weight of truth. Clara froze for a second, her lips parting slightly. She had expected admiration, gifts, perhaps even flattery, but not such raw honesty. For once, she found herself without a ready reply. She tilted her chin and smirked, trying to mask the sudden rush in her chest. "You like me," she repeated, as if the idea amused her. But deep inside, she felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. Demilla didn't press. He simply nodded, his expression steady. "Yes. I like you. Not because of how you look or because of what people say. I like your fire, your boldness. I see more in you than others see." His words sank into her like drops of rain falling on dry ground, though she refused to show it. The rest of the evening passed with a strange energy in the air. Clara laughed more than usual, though she caught herself and tried to tone it down. Demilla, usually reserved, found himself smiling at her every gesture. They were two very different souls, yet something between them was drawing tighter, like invisible strings pulling them closer. By the time the night ended, both of them knew this was no longer a passing admiration, it was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Back at home, Clara lay awake on her bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in her life, she felt unsure. She told herself she was in control, that she could bend this billionaire to her will. But in the quiet of the night, she admitted to herself that he had touched her heart in a way no man ever had. She hated that vulnerability, yet she craved more of it. Demilla, too, sat in his private study that night, staring at the city lights beyond his window. He thought about Clara's eyes, about her laughter, about the walls she built around herself. He knew she was proud, even arrogant at times, but he also sensed a wounded heart beneath the surface. He wondered what his mother would say if she knew. He wondered if he was walking into a blessing or a curse. Yet, he could not turn back. The admiration that began from afar had now become something undeniable. They had crossed a line, and neither of them could pretend otherwise. Somewhere deep in the city of Lagos, two souls, one hardened by pride, the other softened by wealth and discipline, were stepping into a story that would change everything. And though the night ended with quiet smiles, the storm ahead was already waiting.